Hey there, welcome back to Tips Over Tea. I am Nicole, your host. This is episode 28, and we're going to talk with Jennifer about the physiology of trauma. We've talked about mental health and things like that, but we tend to not talk a whole lot about how our body responds to trauma. So if this sounds like a topic of interest to you, I want to encourage you. Grab your tea, grab your notebook, grab your questions, grab a friend, and listen in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Tips Over Tea. I am Nicole, your host. We have the great pleasure of chatting with Jennifer today, and we're going to talk about the physiology of trauma. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Nikki. It's an honor to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that we get to cover this topic because a lot of times people may not recognize that there may be a sense of trauma, because a lot of times we associate trauma with like sexual abuse or physical abuse, and trauma could present or occur from so many different instances, right? So what would you define as trauma, or what are some definitions that have brought light bulbs to people with respect to the definition of trauma?
That's an excellent question. One definition of trauma that really changed my perspective and changed my life, really, about how I see trauma, is that trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. So and if you really think about that definition, there's nothing in the definition about an actual event. And I've come to realize in my personal life that really one of the worst traumas I've ever experienced, there was no intent. I was a little girl, and it was a situation that to the adults around me, it was funny. To my dad, he got angry and I got in trouble. And I didn't understand why there were people laughing at me, like literally on the floor with tears coming out their eyes, laughing at me. Wow. I didn't understand why dad was screaming at me. And nobody helped me as a little girl understand what was really going on. So I went into a freeze dissociative response. And that freeze dissociation has been something that I've been challenged with my whole life. And I used to say when I was younger, I've really worked on this a lot, but I used to say, when I was younger, like up through my 30s, even into my early 40s, I would say, I have this wonderful gift. I can look somebody straight in the face and totally ignore them and they don't know it. And I didn't realize that that was how I owned my own dissociation. That's what I was doing. I would look at somebody and they'd be talking to me, but their voice would be almost like at the end of a tunnel, almost like wah, 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 and I'd be off somewhere else in my mind. I trained myself to keep a straight face. How it wasn't conscious, it just happened. And so that's what got me interested in the physiology of trauma, because I knew keeping a straight face and pretending to pay attention wasn't something that I chose to do. It wasn't like, okay, I don't like what they're saying right now. It wasn't a conscious choice. And that's when I started, again, in my 40s, when I really started to study trauma and learn about it, that's when I realized that this is how trauma gets into your physiology. And then I started to learn about the nervous system and how trauma affects the nervous system. And of course, the nervous system is our neurobiology. And so it's been changing.
That's huge, because it's not, whenever you hear about it, people think about like the physical response of it. And the way you described your response, like just looking someone straight in their face and not really being there physically, like mentally, no one would ever associate that with trauma. That's just like ignoring someone because you don't like what they say.
Right. And because of how that plays out in social situations, the shame that comes from it, because in that situation as a child, that was overwhelmingly shameful. And so I really was overtaken by shame in my childhood. And that was one of the events that fed into it. That was a really big event that fed into it. And in social situations in adulthood, when that happens, then people start to point the finger and say, well, you're not listening, you're not paying attention. And they get really accusatory rather than trying to understand. So when the accusations start to come, the shame just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then we withdraw more and more and try to compensate even more. And then that's where people put on these so-called masks, and they're not presenting their true selves to the world because other people can't handle, for some reason, the truth about the dissociation. It doesn't have anything to do with the person that you're talking to.
Yeah.
It's something inside of the person who's listening. A lot of times they can't control it. And when we can't get to a point of understanding and compassion, it just grows and gets bigger.
Yeah. And especially if you don't realize that you yourself are doing that. So you think something's wrong with you because they're accusing you of because of your response. And you're like, but I don't understand. And then it just really just a never ending cycle, like, especially if you don't have an understanding.
Exactly. And when we don't understand our own physiology, it can send us further into shame, because inside we know these things are happening. We just don't know why. And then we start to believe that, yeah, what they said is right. There is something wrong with me. I am a terrible person. I'm, whatever the vitriol is that's spewed at you, you just start to take it in and believe it.
Yeah. And I imagine, because the physiology, there's energy. And so you tend to attract situations that continue to put you in those types of situations to reinforce what you're starting to believe about yourself. You recognize that with people when you work with clients, like, why does this keep happening? Or
there is a why does this keep happening? And what I've realized is when people can start to get to the roots of it. I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard this a gazillion times out there, people talk about peeling back the layers of the onion. And I'm like, screw the damn layers. Let's go for the root. And that's exactly what I do in my practice. We go for the root. And the questions that I ask my clients, a lot of times they're like, oh, and then they really have to stop because they're like, wow, I didn't see that question coming, or I've never been asked anything like that before, because I've learned questions that can help people get to the root of it. And the roots of this stuff almost always go back to childhood, almost always. And a lot of times they're little events that, one of the ways that I coach my clients is when we get back to childhood and we are in the experience of it. Because I work, like I said, I work with the physiology of trauma and how it gets imprinted in the nervous system. So trying to think where I want to go with the conversation right now. We hear about fight, flight, and freeze all the time, but there are more states of the nervous system than just fight, flight, and freeze. There's a tend and befriend state with Stephen Porges and his polyvagal theory. Has really opened up a whole new world, because in the sympathetic, there's the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. There's also the parasympathetic branch. And in the parasympathetic branch, everybody knows about rest and digest because it's the opposite of fight or flight. And so they see these as opposites, but also within the parasympathetic branch is the social engagement system. The social engagement system can get dysregulated very easily. And so when you have a dysregulated social engagement system, which can lead to attachment issues, and also, like this ability to fight, flight, or freeze, then a lot of times people don't realize it, but they have one foot on the brake and one foot on the gas, and they're half pressed at the same time. And sometimes they're both floored, and what that does to a car, you spin donuts.
Well, that sounds like fun.
Well,
but not in life.
If it's the rear wheel drive, you spin donuts. But that can be what happens in our nervous system. So, and I think a lot of people understand that impulse where they've been in situations where they want to lean in, but they're terrified and they want to back away at the same time. It's like, it's almost like the song, should I stay or should I go? Should I lean in? Should I back away? Is this safe? Is this not safe? So there's almost this overcoupling in the nervous system of safety and threat at the same time. Like desire to lean in and help versus pull away and protect.
Yeah. So,
and I think most people can relate to that. And that is not something that happens consciously, but it's something that we can recognize whenever you pick it apart, and that's a dysregulated nervous system. And there are ways to work with that. And, and I've said this several times before, we hear about these practices that talk about rewiring the brain, like neurons fire together, wire together.
Yeah.
And the paradox of that is talking doesn't get neurons to fire together or wire together. It's the experience. And so it's getting people back into the experience that was overwhelming and helping shift that experience to something more manageable, which is why we go back to the roots of it, because we go to the roots and then we start to shift it. And we start to look at situations from different angles.
I can see that you're retraining the experience, your nervous system to that experience what you could have experienced versus what you did experience, or how your nervous system interpreted that experience.
Yeah. And right. And it's coming to an understanding of our own experiences in childhood. A lot of times I'll have clients, and I've for some reason, I've been encountering this a lot lately with new clients that will come in and say, oh, I had a really loving household, growing up. Like, my parents were so kind. They were so loving. They were so wonderful. Like, I don't know where my trauma comes from. I don't understand it. And then we get back to childhood, and, and then the story starts to unfold. Dad was an alcoholic, but there was no trauma, or, things like this, or, mom had bipolar, but there was no trauma. And so getting people to understand that, yeah, there was, and there were parts of your childhood, not all of it, but there were parts that were really hard.
Yeah.
Parts that were really hard need to be heard. And that challenge, because a lot of times there's grief or sadness or anger that's still being held and suppressed.
Yeah.
Understanding where that comes from. And also being able to take logic and reason and analysis and set it aside. Because it is so easy whenever we get into that experience for the mind, that present ego mind, to go into, but I know that my parents were challenged and they did the best they could. And all of that's true.
Yeah.
Your parents probably did do the best they could. We're not blaming your parents for anything. We're just saying, yeah, I can understand in this situation that, look at how you blamed yourself. Look at how you came to the conclusion that it's all my fault, or that I'm not lovable, or that I'm not terrible. It's not about blaming your parents. It's about understanding that this was a difficult situation for you as a child, and you're still somewhere inside carrying that anger, carrying that grief, carrying that sadness. That grief and that anger, that sadness, or whatever that emotion is, needs to be understood before it can be dealt with and before it can be released.
Yeah.
And that is the reason I don't get on board with positive psychology, and to the extent that it's hijacking or bypassing. That, oh my gosh, I feel anxious, I have to think positive. No, we need to pick apart that anxiousness and understand it. Where do the roots go?
Yeah. I can see where the positive psychology piece could help if you're in public and you need to get yourself back together. But then after that, when you can, we need to come see you.
But there are people who take that positive psychology too far, and then it ends up suppressing it even more. And then when it comes back later, then you've got a full-blown diagnosis, like PTSD or, bipolar, or something even worse, possibly.
Sure. So a couple of things came to mind as you were speaking. The first one is, because you know how people are like, I'm afraid of public speaking. A lot of people are afraid of public speaking, but sometimes it could be a trauma response, as opposed to you just getting comfortable with speaking in public. So how would you identify if it's something just uncomfortable, or something that you may need to dig deeper into, trauma-wise?
I think public speaking is a primal fear. I think it's more than just an irrational fear, because if you go back to the early days of humans, being part of the tribe was necessary for survival. So if something happened, because even tribal communities weren't perfect, there were disputes and confrontations and arguments and fights, and if you displeased the chief, you were kicked out of the tribe, you were on your own. And that was almost certain death. So you put yourself in front of an audience, whether it be on social media or in person in front of a crowd, and they laugh at you, they boo you off the stage, back in the day, they throw tomatoes at you, whatever it is, that level of humiliation. We see people having their lives ruined every single day, and not just in this country, but in other developed countries, because of public shame and public humiliation. And that's heartbreaking. Yeah. It's really heartbreaking that people have to spew their anger and their vitriol at somebody else to the point that it ruins their life.
Got it. So it could be a trauma response, but it's most likely a survival type thing.
People are more likely to fear public speaking than they are to fear death. At one point, and I don't know if it still is, but at one point, public speaking was the number one fear. Death was the number two.
It's so interesting.
Yeah.
And it shows you how we haven't evolved that much in our systems, right? Like our nervous systems and all that stuff. Like that was seemingly a long time ago, but it's still innate.
Right.
And the other thing that came to mind when you were speaking is how it just brings me back to your definition of trauma, right? It's your response. Like you were mentioning how a child had a parent that was bipolar, or a parent that was an alcoholic. And even if those parents never struck that child or did anything to that child, the child witnessed that, and their nervous system picked that up as a traumatic experience.
Right. Well, and all of our parents who listen to Dr. Spock for generations, we're going on 3 generations of Dr. Spock, like the getting babies to learn to sleep on their own, and just let them cry it out. That alone is enough to imprint trauma in the nervous system, because babies are they don't have the capacity to ask for what they need. So they get fussy when they need something. They cry out or they act out in order to get their needs met. They might throw a tantrum to get their diaper changed, or cry to get fed, or cry to be held, because babies need touch. They need eye contact with their parents. And when we look at current day parenting, the parents who hold their babies but flip through their phones, or are scrolling through their iPads instead of paying attention to their baby, that is enough to cause attachment issues. An attachment breach between the parent and the child, because the child needs that eye contact. And there are some really fascinating studies that they actually had to pull some of the studies. There's a guy named Ed Tronick, and he did what's called a still face experiment. You can look it up on YouTube, the still face experiment.
Whole face?
Yeah, still face experiment. And it was with an infant, and you can see the social engagement system. And in just less than a couple minutes, minute and a half, you can see all the cycles that the baby goes through to try to get the mom's attention, when the mom is just looking at her with no expression, still face. And they had to call it because they were afraid that quickly it could start to imprint trauma in the baby. They kept the experiments really brief, really brief, so as not to cause lasting damage.
It breaks my heart just thinking about that.
But it happens all the time. And then whenever you think about babies, like when we were little, I know my mom, left us in the crib to cry it out. And, things like that. And in my generation, we didn't know better. We put our kids in timeout, and that was very similar. The timeout was very similar. Go sit at the wall and stare at the wall. And I look back and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. But I did.
That was my generation as well. That and spankings. So what would you say, if someone's trying to figure out if they're having a trauma, if they have a trauma that they need to deal with, what would they need to consider or think about before reaching out to you? I'm sure you do consultations or something, but
I do.
Before coming to you, what would be a sign for them that, because you're fighting yourself. You're like, there's something wrong with me, or I need to fix this, or whatever. How do you know it's a potential trauma response versus just you not wanting to step out and do something new or whatever.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. A trauma response is going to be a repeating pattern throughout your life.
Okay.
So it's going to show up like a reactiveness,
Mm-hmm.
or a coping mechanism or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And don't get me wrong, not all coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms are bad, so to speak. Some of them can be really beneficial and really helpful to help us self-soothe and, like you said, calm yourself in public or calm yourself in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
That can be really beneficial. And also, it's really important to look at yourself and look at your own patterns and discern what's beneficial and what's not. Because, like addictions are a coping mechanism, because when people turn to a substance, whether it's alcohol or prescription pills or illegal drugs that you get on the street, whatever it is, we shame those people, we blame them. And also, the number one question that people aren't asking is, what does this do for you? How does it help you? What does it give you?
Yeah.
Because we have to understand what they get from it if we're going to help them get that without the drug as the crutch.
Yeah.
Same thing with gambling addictions, pornography addictions, shopping addictions, whatever that is, and behavioral addictions, like gossiping and complaining,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of that whole mob mentality,
Mm-hmm.
that type of behavioral addiction. Again, you get something from it, and so helping people understand, what do you get, and so that takes more of a deeper dive. And if somebody wanted to work with me, I do require a consultation, which is free, because I work within the relational model, not the behavioral model. The behavioral model is top down, like more like talk therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Relational model is about co-regulation, and it's about repairing the social engagement system. So willingness is really, really important. People have to be willing to take a deep dive.
Yeah.
And honesty, being honest with yourself.
Yeah.
And and that's the big thing, being honest with yourself and being vulnerable enough to be honest with your therapist or practitioner or whoever that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's amazing to me how many people lie in therapy. That's not helpful.
It's not, and that's something else to dig into for them. There's so many reasons that could be, but another coping mechanism, because you're so used to being judged, but yeah, what I do appreciate about you, and it's been like this ever since I've met you, is just that you create a space that feels really safe and really non-judging. So definitely would like to encourage anyone to reach out to you, because you're like, let's do this. I got you.
Yeah. And I really do take a lot of effort into not judging other people and not judging their experiences, not judging their behaviors. That's been a challenge in the last couple of years. Judgment within us, for sure. And also, being more discerning rather than judging.
Yeah. Yeah. Just because, everybody responds to things differently. And so just tackling it. That's the key. And just encouraging folks not to judge themselves and give themselves grace and kindness as they're going through this releasing or getting to the root of it to begin with. Because you could have siblings in the same environment and they come out with completely, like, one will be traumatized and the other won't, and it'll be easy to like get on yourself, like, why didn't I respond that way, or why couldn't I have, or
Right. Well, and I think it's important too to look at how we define how people define what's okay and what's not okay. Because I've seen people say, like kind of what you were saying, two kids can come out of the same household and one will be like a successful executive, CEO type, and the other one might end up homeless and addicted to opioids or whatever. And they look at one as a failure and one as a success. What we don't know about what we see as success on the surface, the tie, the money, the high-powered job, what's his family life really like? Is he
Mhm.
really paying attention to his family, or is he more interested in accumulating money, or what's really happening in his life? That's what we don't know. People judge based on the surface
Yeah.
rather than what's really happening. And that's the thing with trauma. If they're both traumatized, then they're both going to have problems in their personal life. It's
Yeah.
just one is more judgmental, like we judge them more on the surface because, we blame people for their homelessness.
Yeah.
And, sometimes I don't know. Like I saw a meme yesterday, like with the guy standing there with Walmart is hiring right next to a homeless guy and like standing, like literally looking down at the guy sitting on the ground.
Mm,
I'm like, okay, how many people can go out and get a job without an address? If you
mhm.
fill out an application and you do not have an address to put down, if you do not have a bus pass to get you to work, how are you going to get a job? And there are so many other layers to that. Those are just first surface things.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Walmart really going to hire this guy and
Right.
is earning minimum wage and not getting 40 hours a week, not having benefits? Is that like, how is that really going to change his life?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
know the issues that come with minimum wage jobs. And
Mhm.
so that type of judgment is, and I'm going to say something really judgmental here. It's stupid.
Yeah.
Ignorant.
Yeah.
Ignorant is not knowing. It's not looking deep enough. It's making a judgment based on surface information, and the surface information is only what you see. If you've
Yeah.
never been in that position, or if you've never volunteered with the homeless or with the addicted or anything like that, you're not going to see, and you're going to make all kinds of assumptions about, well, it should be easy. All he's got to do is go get a job. No,
Yeah.
it's not that easy.
Yeah.
And so the trauma interferes with your life. It causes problems in relationships.
Mhm.
It causes problems with your own self-image, with how you see yourself.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And you're right. The successful sibling, their addiction could just be working or,
and we know a lot of times, in upper class families, domestic violence and domestic abuse and
Mhm.
malignant narcissism is a real thing.
Mhm.
Because there is a personality type that goes with that high powered, high achieving personality, and there are the shadow side of that can be really difficult for family and friends and
Yeah.
coworkers, and yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Not always, but
Right, right, right.
it's not to paint everybody with the same brush and
Right.
know each person individually. I think that's important, not to paint everyone with the same brush.
Absolutely. Well, I think you kind of said that just by emphasizing going deeper, right? Like really stop looking at surface level stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
you definitely made that come into awareness. Like that nobody fits on this. Like there's no one size fits all type thing. You just never know, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I appreciate that you made that a point. Like
Mhm.
surface, the cover, that you only see the cover.
Yes,
Open the book.
exactly.
So awesome. Well, as always, 30 minutes goes by quick. So before we run out of time, I would love for you to share if you have any offers that you'd like to give, programs coming up, workshops, or anything like that. Feel free to share, and I'll definitely have your contact information in the description, of course. So,
Okay. Yeah. You can find me at jenniferwhitacre.com.
mhm.
And if you can see the screen, the spelling of Whitacre's on the screen here. And you can email me at info@jenniferwhitacre.com. I have I'm a trauma coach. I like the scope of practice of a coach. I
Mhm.
choose that rather than a clinician. So I don't take insurance. And I have an empowerment strategy program, is what I call it,
Love it.
because people lean into empowerment, not trauma.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's kind of the flip side of trauma.
Yeah.
But I really am a trauma coach. I specialize in developmental and generational patterns.
Mhm.
And like I said, really getting to the root. I don't mess around with peeling back the layers.
Mhm.
And so if anybody's interested, like I have a 12 session package that a lot of my clients start out with, and my rates are discounted for that.
Mhm.
So if anybody's interested, they can just email me, or go to my website or reach out. And I'm
Awesome.
happy to set up that free consultation, because that free consultation gives both me and the prospective client a chance to get to know each other a little bit and find out if we can work together.
Yeah.
Because and I tell everybody that comes into that consultation, if you have a sense that you don't like me or something feels off,
Mhm.
let me know. I'll help you find somebody else to work with, because in the relational model, it is
Mhm.
so important to have rapport and safety with your practitioner.
Yeah.
If you've ever been in a session, doesn't even have to be therapy session, even getting your hair cut, and you're like, I don't like this chick who's cutting my hair, or
Mhm.
who the hell is this guy?
Mhm.
You're not going to make any progress.
Yeah.
You don't want, I don't even want people touching my hair if I don't feel good around them. Alone touching my trauma.
Right.
So, so
Right.
that's so important in the relational model, to have that
Yeah.
rapport and sense of safety with who you're working with.
Oh, absolutely. Especially working with something
Hmm.
like trauma. So for sure, because otherwise you'll just create a whole nother trauma situation. So,
Absolutely.
mhm. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jennifer. It's been a pleasure getting to know you again and speak with you about this. And those of you who are watching live and those of you who catch this later, I hope you got some really good nuggets. Really just think about, if you're beating yourself up about something, stop. But just really reach out to Jennifer, even if you're not sure if it's trauma. I'm sure you guys can figure something out together. So awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you, everybody who hung out with us today.
Thank
And
you for having me, Nikki.
you're welcome. See you guys next time. Ciao. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure you like, subscribe, and click the bell so you'll be notified anytime we upload a new video or go live. And as always, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to post it in the comments. We're always checking that. In the meantime, have a great